Alright, so today marks the start date of the 2019 Canadian Championship. With the advent of the Canadian Premier League, this year's edition of the Canadian Championship features 13 teams, which is more than double the most in a previous Canadian Championship, which was 6 last year. Now, to accommodate this many teams and an odd number of teams, the Canadian Championship has made a little bit of a wacky format this year with multiple qualifying rounds, but the first qualifying round starts off tonight, and that's where I'm going to start off my predictions with the first round. So here are the matchups for the first qualifying round. We have Voyageurs versus the Halifax Wanderers, York 9 FC versus AS Blainville, and the Calgary Cavalry versus Pacific FC in the only all-Canadian Premier League matchup of the first round. Now for the first matchup, Vaughan versus Halifax, Vaughan being a League One Ontario team, Halifax Wanderers being a Canadian Premier League team. The Halifax Wanderers are the obvious favorites there, and given the fact that most of the star players from League One Ontario ended up moving to the Canadian Premier League, I feel like that league's a little bit weaker this year, and because of that, this should be an easy win for Halifax Wanderers. They're obviously the better team on paper. They're a fully professional team, so they should take that. And for the second matchup, AS Blainville versus York 9, kind of the same deal. AS Blainville plays in the Premier League du Soccer Quebec. I think that's how you pronounce it. My French is very shoddy. York 9 is a Canadian Premier League team, albeit right now, with the early standings going, one of the worst ones. This should be York 9's matchup. Blainville might be able to pull off a bit of an upset, especially because it'll be York 9's first ever time playing at home next week when they play at York Lions Arena. Maybe the new setting will be a little shaky for York 9, who knows. But I have a feeling that the Canadian Premier League teams should win against the Tier 3 provincial teams. So I have York 9 moving on against Blainville. And now the final matchup of the first qualification round, Calgary Cavalry versus Pacific FC. Calgary is 3-0 to start off the Canadian Premier League. They have just been absolutely dynamite to start off. They're probably the best team in the league right now. I have them moving on easily against Pacific. And with the 3 Canadian Premier League teams moving on, the second round becomes this. The Winnipeg Valor facing the Halifax Wanderers, FC Edmonton against York 9, and the Calgary Cavalry against the Hamilton Forge. Now, I'm going to be fully honest, the Canadian Premier League to start off this season has just been so tight all around. Really, no one's been miles better than anyone else. All the teams are scoring about the same rate. There's been no real blowouts. So to call these all Canadian Premier League matchups is incredibly tight. For the first matchup of Winnipeg versus Halifax, I'm gonna have to say Winnipeg takes it just because they've had a bit of a better start to their Canadian Premier League campaign. They're gonna be slightly more rested because they've played 2 less games, not having played the first leg of the Canadian Championship. The Canadian Premier League has a very tight schedule, a lot of midweek games. So just tiredness will probably play a factor. So because of that, I think the Winnipeg Valor are going to move on. For the second matchup, FC Edmonton versus York 9. York 9 has not had a very strong start to their Canadian Premier League campaign. FC Edmonton's been okay. They've both only played 2 games at the time of me filming this video, so there's really not very much to go off of. Now, I'm going to say FC Edmonton takes this, because they do have a lot of players brought back from the old FC Edmonton that played in the North American Soccer League and has Canadian Championship experience. So because of that, just because they've been here before, I have FC Edmonton moving on against York 9. And for the final matchup, Calgary Cavalry versus Forge FC. I mean, we just saw Calgary beat Hamilton on the weekend 2-1 in Hamilton, and they've, again, been 3-0 to start off the Canadian Premier League season. They're probably the best team in the Canadian Premier League right now. So I'm going to have Calgary moving on against Hamilton. And with those results, the third round now becomes Winnipeg Valor versus Ottawa Fury, Montreal Impact versus FC Edmonton, and Vancouver Whitecaps versus Cavalry FC. Now, round 3 seems like a pretty easy one to call. The only real question mark game will be Winnipeg Valor versus Ottawa Fury. Now, this will be the first real test as to whether or not the Canadian Premier League is better than the USL. Honestly, I don't know how to call this one. Players who played in USL are playing in the Canadian Premier League now. Some MLS teams are loaning players out to both the USL and the Canadian Premier League. There just seems like right now there's no easy way to tell which league is better. And this will be the first time that 2 teams from both those 2 leagues meet and play each other. Now, Ottawa Fury is a weaker USL team. That does give Winnipeg a bit of an advantage, I think. And I feel like Winnipeg will probably win just because for the Canadian Premier League team, this is a huge measuring stick game for them, especially since earlier in the year, the Ottawa Fury said they did not want to join the Canadian Premier League and they chose to stay in USL when the Canadian Premier League owners wanted Ottawa Fury to join. So for Winnipeg Valor, you feel like their players are going to be like going for it. This is a huge game for them to prove that Ottawa should have gone to the Canadian Premier League, that the Canadian Premier League is the better league than the USL, and I feel like they're just going to have a fire lit under them, and because of that, Winnipeg will go through. Now, FC Edmonton, Montreal, and Vancouver, Calgary, I'm going to say the exact same thing for both of them. Since the Canadian Championship abolished the group stage format, no MLS team has ever lost to a non-MLS team. Now, I know the Canadian Premier League is another Tier 1 league in Canada, but compared to the MLS, it's not really close. The salary cap isn't anywhere near the MLS's salary cap. It's much more comparable to the USL in terms of skill, and a USL team has never beaten an MLS team in the Canadian Championship. Some have come close, but usually it just has been complete blowouts. Do I think at some point Canadian Premier League teams will be able to beat MLS teams in the Canadian Championship? Yes. Down the road, I feel like when the Canadian Premier League gets bigger, there will probably be plenty of cases where Canadian Premier League teams do beat the MLS teams. But right now, in the Canadian Premier League's first season, they're still getting going. Their quality of play isn't as high as it will become, hopefully. I feel like both the MLS teams, Vancouver and Montreal, are easily going to move past and go into the semifinals. And now, for the semifinals, we have Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver versus Montreal. For Toronto, Winnipeg, I'm going to say the same thing I said for the Vancouver and Montreal matchups in the semifinals. The MLS team's going to win. Done deal. So Toronto will move on to the final. Vancouver, Montreal. I feel like Montreal has had a very good start to the season in MLS this year. Vancouver is not in a playoff spot. Montreal is. And Montreal has Ignacio Piatti, who will be the best player by a mile in that matchup. I just feel like right now this season, Montreal's showing that they can play. Vancouver's been kind of not really in a playoff spot in a league system where most teams are in playoff spots. So Montreal will move on to the final. And with that, the final of the Canadian Championship comes out to be Toronto FC versus the Montreal Impact. A good old-fashioned 401 derby. Now, again, this is a total toss-up. Both Toronto FC and Montreal Impact have had pretty good starts to the MLS season, although Toronto FC has been starting to show some problems right now. So just looking at how they've performed in MLS, it seems like Montreal is the favorite. However, in this tournament, it doesn't seem to matter how bad Toronto FC is, they somehow managed to win. It seems like in Toronto FC's worst seasons, they still come out with a Canadian Championship victory. So you gotta feel like just the team that has shown over and over and time again that they're able to win the Canadian Championship and have the upper hand. But this year, I'm going to say that this is going to be Montreal's Canadian Championship. The Impact have surprised me in MLS. They seem to have things figured out somehow this season. And I think that Toronto FC just has way too many problems to beat them in the Canadian Championship in a one-game final. Their defense is just miserable right now. So I think the Montreal Impact are going to beat Toronto FC and win the 2019 Canadian Championship. So that's it for my predictions. Hit like if you like this video, hit subscribe if you want to see more of my stuff, and comment down below of who you think is going to win the Canadian Championship this year. I'll see you next time.